Thank you for the opportunity to speak. My name is Joy Connolly. I'm a member of the Homecoming Coalition, a human rights organization founded to ensure planning practices promote inclusion, not exclusion. But today I come with a mandate not only from Homecoming, but from many other organizations as well. Social Planning Toronto, and we have Sean Mahar, who will also speak on behalf of them, the Wellesley Institute, the Co-op Housing Federation, Ontario Region, the Ontario Nonprofit Housing Association, the Advocacy Centre for Tenants Ontario, ACORN, and the Federation of Metro Tenants. Each of these organizations plays its own part in promoting the well-being of this city, but on this issue, we speak as one. The draft inclusionary zoning regulations as presented by the Ontario government on December 18th fall short, very far short, of the sort of program Toronto needs. The fundamental problem is this. When the Ontario government introduced legislation that would permit municipalities to enact their own inclusionary zoning policies, it described the legislation as giving tools to municipalities and restoring local decision-making. It was permission the City of Toronto had asked for repeatedly, and for good reason. As Toronto's former chief planner noted, if Toronto had had even a modest inclusionary zoning program, it could have generated 12,000 units of affordable housing in the past 5 years. That's more than was generated through all new affordable housing programs in Toronto combined. We need these affordable homes for our own children, for a growing population, for people who work in Toronto but are now driving 2 hours to get here. But these regulations seem to have forgotten that the aim was to permit municipalities to act, as instead tied their hands, with limitations that are unheard of south of the border, where over 800 jurisdictions use inclusionary zoning to generate affordable housing. The result? We're estimated, it's a casual analysis, but under these regulations, Toronto might be able to create 100 to 200 sort of affordable ownership homes. There are many restrictions, but I'm going to highlight 4. The portion of affordable units generated is a maximum of 5% or up to 10% near high-density transit station areas. For most municipalities in the U.S., the portion is 15 to 20%. Fewer than 10% of municipalities have limits of 10% or lower. In New York City, it's 50%. The important point is this, that each municipality sets its own rules, working with developers, planners, advocates, and hiring independent consultants to find that sweet spot that creates the most affordable housing while still stimulating new housing supply. Second, these regulations require municipalities to pay 40% of the cost of affordable units and then tie affordability levels to this contribution. Some municipalities in the U.S. do offer incentives to developers, but they're not required to, and studies show that they don't get more affordable housing by doing so. Third, affordability is limited only to ownership housing, not new rental buildings, and its rental is a top priority for us. And fourth, the regs put a 20 to 30-year time limit on the affordability period. This just punts the affordable housing crisis to the next generation, and we gain nothing by doing so. The premise here seems to be that the Ontario government needs to protect developers from rogue municipalities. But the experience in the U.S. tells us it's not developers that absorb the costs of creating affordable homes, and it's not the other people living in the building who are charged what the market will bear no matter what. What inclusionary zoning does is it gently lowers the price of land. That's the flexible part. It means land speculators will get a return incidentally made possible by public investment in transit, roads, parks, and so on, but maybe just not as much as they hoped. And why should we be supporting inflated land prices at the expense of ordinary people who just need a home to live in? This is not inclusion. This is not recognizing that, as the National Housing Strategy just announced says, housing rights are human rights. We organizations are going to do our part to return these regs to the legislation's original purpose, to let municipalities decide on the policies that will permit development to flourish and create affordable housing at the same time. But as the City of Toronto, you have a bigger voice than us all. So we urge you to call upon your staff to bring forward recommendations for Ontario. It's a lot of work, but the payoff is huge. We are right behind you. Thank you.
Question, Councillor Perks.
So, Joy, I want to make sure I heard you correctly. You offered two numbers. One, which was a projection for how many affordable units we could build with a good inclusionary zoning bylaw. What was that number?
Well, according to the former chief planner, it was over a 5-year period,
yes.
12,000 units.
12,000, and I think you gave a second number, which is what you imagine would be possible under this.
Yes, my second number is not a firm number, but based on early analysis, people are thinking between 100 and 200 units of affordable ownership.
Is that per year?
Per year.
So over a 5-year period, 500 to 1,000. So this is less than 1/10 of what the former chief planner projected a good inclusionary zoning bylaw could generate.
That's correct.
And you said you were speaking on behalf of a number of organizations today. Could you just tell me what they were?
Sure. So, Social Planning Toronto is part of the group. The Wellesley Institute, the Co-op Housing Federation, Ontario Region, the Ontario Nonprofit Housing Association, the Advocacy Centre for Tenants Ontario, ACORN, and the Federation of Metro Tenants.
Thank you very much for coming today, Joy.
Thank you.
Thank you. What is that? Oh, okay. Question, Councillor Barlow. I wasn't quite sure what it was. You moved forward and kind of made some moves there. Councillor Barlow, questions.
Just a quick question, Joy. We know that the province is trying to also create legislation to an entire province.
Yes.
And this is complicated legislation. The numbers work very differently. In Kingston that it work in Toronto. We even see it inside our city that is very different. There's different scenarios. Is that also one of the reasons that you think more should be left to the municipalities so they can respond to the economics and the needs of each municipality individually and create a legislation that works economically as well as socially for the city?
Absolutely. The initial legislation was good in that it was permissive legislation. It created an umbrella under which cities, including Toronto, which always had asked for this, to be able to move forward. These restrictions ignore the variations among municipalities.
Because you would agree, and I think the sector would agree with what staff has been telling us, is that we have to find that soft spot, right, where development continues to happen, because that's the way we're going to get the units, but that we get as much as affordable housing as possible. So there's that equilibrium between the units that we're getting, but also there's the affordability factor coming into play as well. Is that what we need to have to look at this issue, as to find that soft spot, that economic soft spot that will continue it to allow it to happen?
I had the opportunity to attend a very interesting conference in Oakland, California, about inclusionary zoning. And what was striking there is that there were no state regulations that said municipalities, you can only do this. They were permissive. Every municipality created their own policies based on the needs, and so they varied tremendously based on, as you say, the sweet spot and the needs of the municipalities. So, for example, Cambridge, Massachusetts, their approach was, for us the number of units isn't the important thing, we need large units. So they based it not on number of units, but square footage in a building. That was their innovations. Others wanted to create money for new nonprofit housing. Others, they wanted inclusion in the building. These are judgment calls that are made by each municipality to meet their own needs.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Sean Mager, you also wanted to speak to us.
Thank you very much, and thank you for including this on the agenda today. I know we're up against a very rapid deadline from the province. Social Planning Toronto has been working on the inclusionary zoning file for many years, including the forum that we held 3 years ago jointly with the city to raise the issues of what we could do with inclusionary zoning. And this last year has been a very important year for that policy, because through concerted work by the city and by the advocacy community and the housing provision community, we've been able to get legislation through. And I think it's worth noting that that legislation went through after extensive consultation, detailed discussion, giant roundtables, huge forums. And the central themes of those discussions were how big should the set-asides be, what should be the duration of the affordable housing, and should there be any kind of compensation to developers for participating in the program. That discussion happened extensively prior to the legislation, and the legislation reached a very sensible conclusion, which is, as the councillor just said, municipalities have very different housing needs and very different housing markets, and the legislation should give municipalities the flexibility to build their own inclusionary zoning strategies that reflect their own markets. Sadly, just on the Friday afternoon, just 2 days before Christmas, the draft regulations that accompanied that legislation came out, and they essentially undid every single thing that the whole consultation and the legislation decided in the first place. They set very narrow caps on how much affordable housing can be built. In fact, they set a 5% limit on how many units you could ask developers to set aside. That is an unusual limit. In the United States, there are very, very few programs, and in Canada, there are very, very few programs that set a cap that low. In fact, 20% is a much more common example in the United States. There are over 100 municipalities that have 20% caps. New York City has a 50% cap. But rather than tell municipalities what their cap should be, the legislation should give Kingston the right to set a cap at what's appropriate for Kingston, and Toronto the right to set a cap of what's appropriate for Toronto. There should be no cap in the legislation. Similarly, the regulation should not do what it now does, which is ban municipalities from making housing affordable for a long period of time. You're not allowed to make housing affordable for more than 30 years under these regulations. So if you come up with a strategy that says we got a way to make housing affordable for 50 years or 99 years or perpetually, the regulation would ban you from doing that, which makes absolutely no sense. And the legislation was silent on that topic for exactly that reason. The other thing that wasn't in the legislation that is in the regulations is a thing that they call now measures and incentives. And believe it or not, these are rules that say municipalities and their taxpayers have to pay developers to comply with the law. That this is also a very odd provision, and a provision that is very unusual in the United States. Very few American inclusionary zoning, of the hundreds and hundreds of inclusionary zoning programs in the United States, very few make any provision at all for compensation to developers, and even those ones rarely use those provisions because, in fact, it is possible for, in fact, it's consistently the case that inclusionary zoning works just fine without asking taxpayers to subsidize developers under the program. In fact, as Joy Connolly mentioned, the evidence is that what happens is the cost of the inclusionary units passes back to something that tends to slow the inflation on land prices, something that adds another benefit to cities like Toronto, where land prices are kind of out of control, and something that tends to dampen them down would be useful for the whole of the housing market, not just for inclusionary zoning. It's also worth noting that there are a couple of other provisions in the regulations that are problematic. One is that the regulations, like the legislation, entitle people to provide inclusionary zoning units off-site, which is a very good idea. So you could build a big condo tower and then say, you know what, I'm going to ask the Cooperative Housing Federation to build a co-op down the block and provide the affordable housing there. And not always does affordable housing mix perfectly well into big condos, so there's some logic to that. Unfortunately, the regulations, for some reason, say you can't use the units in an off-site development unless 50% of the units are market units, which basically means that the nonprofit housing world will not participate in that program. They can't afford, they don't have the capital or the internal capacity to build twice as many units as they really need to in order to comply with that. So only the development industry will participate in that, even though what we know is that we get more units of longer duration and affordability when the affordable housing and nonprofit housing world participates. So the nonprofit housing community should be exempted from that constraint, certainly. Similarly, there's a provision that excludes purpose-built rental, and we understand why that's attractive as an option. Unfortunately, if you look at the Toronto housing market, most of the purpose-built rental that's going up is high-end purpose-built rental, which ought to participate in an inclusionary zoning policy. And so the regulations shouldn't tell every single market not to use purpose-built rental, because in some markets, purpose-built rental makes sense. So again, they should leave it up to the municipalities, who, in my view, are responsible stewards of their development, to make that choice for themselves. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions? Councillor Perks.
Thank you. Sean, so do you view the proposal that the province of Ontario has put forward as an improvement over our current ability to use Section 37 funds to generate affordable housing?
So the legislation that they passed was a significant improvement. It gave us the potential for stable, consistent, reliable system of providing for community benefits from development. These regulations essentially repeal the existing legislation and replace it with exactly the legislation that the community asked and the city asked the province not to pass, which gives us substantially less than we could probably bargain in a case-by-case basis from Section 37. A 5% cap on affordable units at a maximum of 30 years of affordability is something I think just about any city councillor could negotiate with a developer in their area.
So this could actually be worse than our current circumstance in some ways.
It could be. It certainly is far, far worse than the legislation that they passed.
Thank you.
Councillor Campbell.
You said that rental stock is excluded from exclusionary zoning?
So under the regulations, you would not be able to ask a developer who is building purpose-built rental to create affordable units in that building. So if you built a purpose-built...
Why is that?
We do now.
I assume it's because the province has taken several steps to try and encourage the creation of purpose-built rental.
Well, they've actually just done the opposite, because they've put in caps on increases. They just extended that, right? I mean, the what do you call it? The rent control. Yeah. Sorry. Well, that's probably a C.D. Howe view, but I mean that's
our analysis and the preponderance of statistical research on the development of purpose-built rental and affordable purpose-built rental suggests that rent controls have very little adverse impact on the creation of purpose-built rental. Public investment tends to be the driver of affordable rental housing.
But when you have rent controls, does not then the construction of purpose-built rental, if it doesn't discourage the construction, does it not encourage higher rents, higher rental, more upscale?
Rent control, again, there's not a strong research base that suggests that that's the case. But what we certainly do see as the pattern that we're getting is, yes, the purpose-built rental that is coming is tending to be higher rent, and as a consequence, it's an ideal candidate for inclusionary zoning, and yet these regulations would exclude it from participating and would exclude you from asking those buildings to participate.
So inclusionary zoning is only intended for basically condominiums.
The way these regulations are written, it would really only apply to condominiums. In fact, inclusionary zoning has been a very useful tool in many, many jurisdictions for creating affordable rental housing and for creating affordable rental housing over a long period of time. These regulations make that nearly impossible.
So last question. So where in Canada has it been most effective?
Most of the evidence actually is in U.S. jurisdictions. There is inclusionary zoning systems in Montreal that have been successful, but really the preponderance of data that we have is from the U.S., where the housing markets are not terribly dissimilar from our housing market.
I'm just wondering, is this in Vancouver?
No, in Montreal they have a good inclusionary zoning system.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Councillor DiCiano, you had questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, and Sean, just a couple of questions, because I'm confused on who the province is actually working to help here.
I share your distress, Councillor.
Yeah, it's a little disturbing. So have they said why developers need incentives to build affordable housing? Is there a reason behind it? Is there, in the jurisdictions that you see that this is, that they are able to build a lot of affordable housing, are there incentives in place there?
In the jurisdictions that have used inclusionary zoning, incentives are relatively uncommon. And in fact, even in the jurisdictions where they're permitted, they're rarely used because, in fact, incentives turn out not to be necessary to make inclusionary zoning work. I will tell you, because I participated in some of the roundtables, the argument that was given by the development community for why incentives should be forced on municipalities. And the argument they made was that no municipality would ever provide incentives to developers to build affordable housing unless they were forced to by the province of Ontario, which was interesting because the week before this city council, the week before that statement was made, this city council passed all of the open door provisions and all of the incentive programs to create affordable housing. And it's pretty clear that municipalities are prepared to play ball with the development community to make sure the development happens and that it generates affordable housing. The province of Ontario, in writing these regulations, has been convinced by someone that municipalities will not. They will actually destroy all development in their jurisdictions unless forced to play ball in a particular kind of way and to play exactly the same ball game in Toronto as in Kingston and Windsor and Peterborough and Ottawa. And I'm afraid, Councillor, I cannot tell you why they reached that conclusion.
Okay.
Last questioner, and then I was going to do a motion to extend so we can move the motions.
Okay, you know what? I'll leave it at that for now, and I'll take it offline a little bit. But thank you very much.
Thank you. So, Councillor Barlow, you wish to move a motion to extend to complete the item?
Yes, and a quick question, just one very quick question
First,
that
a
hasn't been
motion
asked.
to extend to complete the item. All those in favour?
Yeah.
Any opposed? That's carried. Questions of the deputant?
Sean, will all the organizations be making submissions, because this is a consultation period, so the city will be making submission. Will the sector also be making different submissions? Well, they're not that, they're common, but they're individual submissions, I should say, to the minister.
Yeah, so there's been an ongoing discussion around inclusionary zoning across the housing providers and housing advocates in Toronto for the last couple of years, and that conversation's ongoing. All of the participants in that will be making submissions, even though the deadline is fairly tight, it's just a couple of weeks from now, and all of them will be making points very, very similar to the ones that I just made and that Joy just made.
Thank you.
And we encourage the city to make a submission and make one also on those same points.
Thank you. So we'll bring this into committee. Councillor Perks, it was your item because you submitted it to us. Do you want to go first?
Just very quickly, I understand Councillor Bailao and yourself have been working on some motions pertaining to this, and I'm comfortable with whatever way you want to go forward, as long as the City Council has an opportunity to speak on this as quickly as possible. It is rare that I have seen such a monstrous failure in public policy as this one. It actually achieves the exact opposite of everything that it was supposed to achieve. It reduces the likelihood, in my view, of getting more affordable housing built in the City of Toronto rather than increasing it. It creates negative incentives, if you will. It's just a giant failure in public policy, and given that I think there isn't a member of Toronto City Council who doesn't understand that we have an affordability crisis here in the City of Toronto, I think it's important we have that opportunity to speak urgently with one voice on this issue. So I encourage you to all support something that gets this to Council as quickly as possible, because we have to speak out on this right now.
Thank you. Councillor Barlow?
Yes, we have. I have a motion. So, as you know, we've been working with the province for a couple of years now. I've been in many of the consultations that the deputants spoke here about. They've consulted with our Affordable Housing Office, and Planning has been working together and submitting our several feedback on this. And one of the concerns that we always expressed on this is that this needs to be a partnership, we understand, with all orders of government, and we feel like right now it's just on our backs. That's what has been put. It's basically almost a downloading of building housing on municipalities, because this is an entire program. That's what it is. We've been doing some math, and the 40% translates into thousands of dollars that the city would have to create of incentives. It's millions of dollars. And I call this feeling good legislation. You know, when you pass legislation that results in nothing, because there's no municipality, I believe, in this province that will actually enact this legislation, and this could actually, at the end, translate into units. And I think that's what we're at risk in here. And so there has been conversations with other municipalities. I know that Councillor Layton has been having conversations with other councillors across the province, and that is being worked on. We will be sending a letter just before the deadline. The deadline is February 1st, and therefore we are asking staff to report to council. But because it's so close to the deadline, I will be giving some highlights of some of our concerns, which are very much in line with what the deputants spoke about in here. But then the whole report will go to council. We are also asking staff to continue the conversations with the province. The city has done quite a bit of work in this, and this is complex legislation. Let's not think that it's not. I remember speaking with the chief housing officer from New York, and one of the first things she said was, make sure that you look at this as also with the economic lenses as well. And that stuck with me. And so we went out. We have studied the economics of this issue to make sure that it works. We have gotten consultants. We have looked at the performers. We have looked at the financial impact that this will have on the industry, on the city, and on the affordability of the units. So we have that. And we know that it's complex legislation, but we know for sure that we're well prepared to put our case forward. We have put our case forward, but it seems like the message did not get across completely. We're going to put it informal to council, and I'm fairly confident that we're going to get a strong support and mandate from council on the city's position on this legislation. This is important legislation that could translate into a significant amount of units in affordable housing, but in the way that it is right now, there are some issues that need to be addressed, and I think that it will consultation period would allow us to give that feedback to the province as well. So I hope that I can have the support not only to have this going to council, but have staff continuing the conversation. It is really important that we continue that conversation with staff. And like I said, I will be also expressing our concerns, some of our concerns as housing advocate as well, and because I've been involved in the conversations, and so I'll be reiterating some of the concerns that have been put forward in the past since day one, and looking forward to having the discussion at council and hopefully a strong support on our position.
Thank you. So I have a motion, and I will add to that to refer the item number 1 from Councillor Barlow to the special meeting unless she's satisfied with the special meeting, and I'll speak to it. My motion is to have a special meeting of the Planning and Growth Committee prior to the council meeting, so staff can bring a report to us that fully outlines the impacts of the legislation, which we've been able to get yet, but they've told me they can do, and I'm actually thinking of the 25th, the day after the executive committee, to come and at least have that. It'll give an opportunity and if we don't have a meeting, then have the report go directly to council. But from speaking to some of my colleagues, I believe they're able to attend on the 25th. I haven't had a chance to canvass everyone. The reason for it as well is that we're hearing today from deputants who have information on a policy matter, which is a planning policy matter that we don't even have here yet, that it's important for us to have the staff perspective and their responses they'd like council to give, and the ability to deal with that and consider that with ourselves and all of our colleagues prior to the council meeting. I think it can give a much better response if we have that report, can consider it, and if we have further questions, we can have those in place for the time that report goes to council and still make the timeline that the province wants. I have no problem with the second part of my colleague's motion to request staff to continue discussions. I think it's absolutely right, and as a housing advocate, you're absolutely fair to bring your concerns out to it. But I truly believe that I couldn't add it to this agenda, and I can't get a report from staff much before that, but they've told me that they can't have a report for that meeting, and hopefully we'll be able to do that. In the issue that's in front of us, developers never pay for anything. It's always the people that purchase the units pay. But in this case, it seems to be that the taxpayer is going to pay to achieve much less than we had ever wanted to achieve. And you can achieve more. Some of the issues I understand are here are Section 37 is going to go away, get rid of our parks, get rid of parking standards, redirect infrastructure funds that we desperately need in our development charges to support the development, to support affordable housing. It seems to be totally contradictory, and really, in many ways, it almost looks like a sham to say I'm doing something when I'm not.
Mr. Chair, oh, sorry.
Can I finish my?
Yes. Sorry.
Oh, I stopped my time at just over 2 minutes. Ask me anything after. But I really have a concern because I don't know enough. I don't know enough today to be able to deal with it. But it definitely doesn't seem to be supportive from our housing advocate, from people that know it, from our own staff, to actually move things forward. It seems to be moving things backwards in a way that we never wanted to have happen. And we've actually shown in developing sites within Build Toronto, which is now Toronto Realty Company, that we don't need 5%, we don't need 10%, we can get 20%, we can get 50% of a development to be affordable in some parts of the city and still have a profitable development out there and put some support into it. And we've done the same thing with rental. We have affordable rental units being built in the city through the policies that we have in place. And this legislation is going to bring everything that we're doing to a halt. Now, we definitely need some type of legislation to help us move forward with inclusionary zoning to make sure that people understand in the development industry what's needed and how to work with it. But we also need flexibility within that. And I think municipalities do across the province to be able to make things work. And from the brief information that I know about the provincial regulations that are going forward, it just isn't going to happen. We are not going to be able to achieve the amount of affordable housing that we could. We won't be able to achieve it comprehensively with the development community. We won't be able to afford it because it looks to me like you're talking hundreds of millions of dollars in support from the City of Toronto, putting in to prop up the affordability issue for private developers. It doesn't make sense. And I want it to make sense before Council makes a decision, so we have that background. So I hope you can support, and I don't know, Councillor Barlow, if you're okay to withdraw your first part of the motion that goes to Council for a report there. If you're okay to support it coming to a special meeting would be helpful. But I'd like to do that, have it here, and then send it to Council. And if for some reason, as I said, my motion is, if for some reason we can't get the meeting together, it will definitely go to Council. That is my motion, that we try first to have the meeting and get quorum, and if we can't, it'll go to Council with the report, but one way or the other, the item will be at the Council meeting. So that's my speaking. Questions of the Speaker.
Okay, questions of the Speaker. So this is not about us making a decision about inclusionary zoning. This is about us commenting on the legislations, right? So we and all the stakeholders, everybody is giving the feedback. Staff and I actually have consulted with the majority of the councillors a while ago when the legislation came through. So all these positions about the Section 37, about the costs of the incentives, have been noted by staff through meetings with individual numbers of councillors that we've been giving this feedback based on those meetings for 2 years now. You do understand that? Okay, because this is questions and stuff. So I'm just...
I understand that a very poor Christmas gift was given to municipalities on the 22nd of December that seemed to be a bomb in the middle of affordable housing instead of a gift that would seem things would go forward. It's often like Scrooge showed up to mess up everything that's been going on. And all that I want to do is be sure that there's a report in the forum that we have where we can have some discussion before it goes to council, where we make a formal response to it. And the example, it might even be earlier today when it came to the issues of heritage. Although we know and we've talked and we've been there, it's still a difficult item to understand. And this is an extremely difficult item. So I'm not looking to take up a day at council on it if we can get the information in advance. But if we have to, we will. So I'm not one that looks for extra meetings, but I can't see in an item like this where it should just go directly to council and could get lost in other items that may become priority at council, and all of a sudden it's the third day at the end of the day that we're trying to deal with it, and it might not be appropriate. And I truly think that we have tremendous support right across council for affordable housing, but I think that people should understand
and for our position, I think that council will be very much...
But we also have an industry that lobbies against things that we do and might be misinforming or misinform some of our colleagues between now and council as well with a different perspective on it, because I don't believe that this was just a dream that was thought up by the minister. I believe this was under some type of pressure that this must have come forward to make it look like it's good, but it looks good, taste it, but actually it's rotten. And that's the problem with it. So I think that we have to be cautious as to what our colleagues know. So I'm just looking to have a special meeting for that. Yes, Councillor.
Mr. Chair,
Are you okay with your questions, Councillor Bala?
I'm going to support your motion, Mr. Chair. Like you said, this is a complex matter, and I think that, and there's a lot of obviously planning points within this legislation. So I think it would be helpful if this committee looked at this in greater detail. We've had now 3 council sessions that we haven't been able to finish. And I think the last council session we didn't. And this is going to take up a lot of time. And I think in order to get the right response back to the province, if this committee further understood it in detail, when it comes to council, we've got 6 members of council who would be better educated on this that could help the rest of council understand the complexities of the issue. So I would, although I'm not into extra meetings either, I'm more than willing to have your motion go forward.
On the motion that I moved, all those in favor? Opposed? Any opposed? That's carried.